Brant is at sale. Brant is a supportive DPS who can work in both carry and sub DPS roles, while providing healing and shielding to the team. Let's dive into our usual analysis and break down his kit, go over build optimization, and wrap up with team comps and DPS calculations. Brant's gameplay revolves around using basic attacks to build up his Forte, and then using it to unleash a huge attack. Reaching certain thresholds of Forte also triggers a party heal. Brant's basic attack option list has a lot of bloat, so let's go over the important details. Here's a table of the base DPS of his various combos. Brant's mid-air attacks offer significantly increased DPS over his grounded attacks. After each mid-air attack, Brant will perform a flip for a little extra damage. When swapping out, the attack will complete and Brant will still do the flip, giving him a very decent quick swap value, especially seeing how the first animation for his mid-air attack is quite fast. Additionally, you can choose to hold Brant's first and second mid-air attacks. The DPS of these isn't too much to write home about, but the extra Forte is needed in some rotations. Swapping out during these charged attacks will instantly cancel them with the flip. Before we continue, let's talk about Brant's passive. He gains a large amount of flat attack based on his energy regen, allowing him to build ER as a more effective source of damage than traditional stats. Additionally, his liberation grants a buff that increases his scaling, while doubling the Forte gain from most of his attacks. With typical stats, this is up to roughly a 40% damage increase, which is a chunky amount but not a complete game changer. Brant's Forte deals a huge amount of raw damage, while granting a shield to the team. This also ends the buff from his liberation. While this attack can be swapped out of and play out in its entirety, remember that buffs such as Sanhua's outro will dissipate as soon as you swap, so it's worth sitting on field for the damage to come out in those cases. His skill does damage, and is a low cooldown, convenient way to get in the air while getting some damage in. Finally, his outro grants a fusion and skill damage amplify, which on paper is perfect for Changli, except for the fact that it goes away on swap like many other outros. It can also be used to decent effect by characters such as Carlotta. Let's quickly go over the combos required to hit full Forte. In a double Forte combo, one where you intro in and Forte prior to using your liberation, you would need to do the full mid-air chain holding one of the two first attacks. With the support rotation that has one intro, you will start on mid-air attack 2, default attack for the whole mid-air sequence, followed by the heavy attack afterwards. These are just a baseline reference. You can be a bit flexible depending on how many times you choose to swap him in. There is plenty to talk about with stat optimization, so let's move on to the next section, builds. Brant has a variety of different builds that revolve around his energy regen conversion passive. Because this conversion only scales ER past 150%, this essentially makes the first 50% ER completely wasted in terms of stats. However, certain rotations require energy regen to even function, so let's start there. When running a Hypercarry rotation with 3 Forte casts per liberation, energy regen is not needed. However, in support rotations which only use 1 Forte per liberation, around 40% is required as a baseline, depending on who you're running with. As such, the main stats you want to prioritize depend on 3 themes: the team you want to run, your substat roles, as well as your weapon choice. When your base ER with your weapon and echoes is around 130%, running double ER main stats is worth more than fusion percent. This holds true until you get to the upper limit of ER. When you are at 280% or higher, currently only achievable with a signature weapon, it's better to use 1 fusion percent in place of ER. So that covers main stats, but substat prioritizations are equally important. Here's a chart with the calculated values of substats when Brant is using his signature weapon. Note that crit still holds the highest value, with energy regen and basic bonus both being equally important. This is to say that you shouldn't prioritize energy regen over double crit, but it's a solid value line if you could get it. Because of how much higher his substat values are than other characters, this means that if you farm for perfect echoes, you'll have much more potential damage to gain. Get farming, husbando enjoyers. There are several different echo setups that you can run with Brant. If you can achieve 250% energy regen, running Tidebreaking Courage is the optimal set. However, this is currently only possible with either his signature weapon or Overture. Molten Rift is a perfectly viable set on him as well, with both versions of Inferno Rider being very close picks. Unintuitively, Nightmare Rider is a better choice in Hypercarry setups, due to Brant's several spread out rounds of DPS benefiting more from a constant but weaker buff. Now that we understand all the different build setups, let's look at weapons. First, we'll look at a chart for Hypercarry Brant. His signature weapon offers the highest damage, as one would expect. However, Red Spring comes extremely close, and has potential to come even closer depending on how your substats roll. Since this Hypercarry setup doesn't need any ER on Brant, you could run full damage 0% ER with Red Spring and reach nearly identical results to the signature weapon. Blazing Brilliance is a notch lower, but Emerald of Genesis offers a solid foundation. Overture is not recommended, although with very good ER rolls, you could use Tidebreaking Courage with it and bump it up oh so slightly. When used as a sub-DPS, a respectable amount of energy regen is required, dampening the effectiveness of various weapons due to subset requirements. Moreover, this lets Brant get the full value out of his weapon's passive, which has low uptime on the part of the buff triggered by his liberation in the Hypercarry team. As such, it pulls ahead much more here, and other weapons fall much closer to Emerald of Genesis. For skill leveling order, prioritize his Forte, followed by basic attack, liberation, intro, and skill. And this wraps up the build section. Let's move on to Teamcomps now. Brant is fairly flexible in the teams he could work with. In the following team introductions, I'll go over a brief, simplified explanation of the rotations, as I won't be able to get footage of them until later. So keep your eyes peeled for a follow-up video if you want to see the full rotation in action. Let's talk about the Hypercarry team first. In this team, we'll pair him with Sanhua and Shorekeeper. We'll start out by building Brant's Forte a bit prior to Sanhua's first outro, and then use his Forte followed by Liberation into another Forte combo. We'll outro back to Sanhua and build up another Sanhua outro, getting a third Brant Forte out before outroing the Shorekeeper and repeating the rotation. Next, let's look at a Changli team. Now, this might sound cursed, as I thought these two words should never go together, but Changli Hypercarry. That's right, because of how substantial Brant's outro is for her, it's actually quite worth it to play Changli like a Hypercarry. Let's take a look at her rotation. Start out with Changli's skill, then use Shorekeeper's Liberation, followed by basic attack 1, 2, 3. Swap back to Changli and use her Liberation and Forte. Swap back to Shorekeeper for one basic attack and Forte, and then swap back to Changli for her True Sight Conquest and Inferno Rider. Swap to Shorekeeper and finish her Forte rotation, with her Echo, basic attack 1, 2, 3, plunge, Forte, skill, and swap out to Brant. Use his liberation, followed by mid-air attacks 2, 3, 4, and a heavy attack, finishing with his Forte. Then do Changli's True Sight charge, skill, conquest, skill, and conquest again. Then the normal Forte, lib, Forte. Make sure to not swap out of Changli too early and let the entire Forte damage go out. Finally, a Carlotta team. In this comp, it's better for Brant to be using Moonlit Clouds. The rotation flow goes extremely similar to other Carlotta comps. Start out with 2 Carlotta skills and swap out. Do your support rotation, optionally sneaking in a few Brant swap-ins. Outro to Brant, do his Forte combo, and outro to Carlotta for her typical burst. How do these comps compare to each other in terms of theoretical DPS? Recall that Brant's potential with better echoes is relatively higher than other characters. For example, getting over 280% ER and using ER fusion over the baseline build can yield around a 3.7% DPS increase even with the same amount of total substats. Remember that that build requires 4 ER substats. The reason only 2 ER substats are used as a baseline is to keep an even distribution of stats outside of double crit, which is much more realistic. If you can get 4 to 5 lines of ER alongside double crit though, more power to you. The various Brant comps are all fairly close to each other, with the Hypercarry rotation performing slightly below the sub-DPS and support rotations. While the Carlotta team is Brant's strongest team in these calculations, it's really a Carlotta team that's taking Brant along for the ride. Lastly, his sequences. How much are they worth? Here's a quick graph that shows the changes in personal DPS. His first 3 sequences are all extremely powerful, nearly doubling his damage output. His S4 and S5, however, either don't do anything at all for his damage, or do very little. His S6 is another jump in damage. This formula of front-loading the value to the first few sequences, and then slowing down at S4 to S5, started with Fabi. I wonder if this is the new standard going forward. Anyways, that wraps up this analysis. There was a lot to talk about with build possibilities. If it was too much to take in, don't worry. You should check out my DPS calculator, now available at Maygi.cz. Here you can find a calculation sheet that contains all the relevant information I just covered for Brant, and also nearly all the previous characters. I've been working really hard on this one over the last couple weeks, so I wish this is a useful resource for all of you. I'll see you guys soon for a Brant rotation guide. Probably. Bye bye! Hey, what's the pirate's favorite substat? ER.